There is a moment in the life of a deeply empathetic person when the outside world keeps making noise, but something inside them falls silent. It is not the silence of defeat. It is not coldness, revenge, or absence of love. It is the moment when the soul stops running after everything it has always tried to save. To outsiders, this change may seem daunting. The person who used to explain everything, forgave everything, understood everything, and remained available to everyone simply begins not to react. And it is precisely here that a reading inspired by Carl Jung becomes decisive. What seems like indifference can be the beginning of a much deeper inner integration. For years, the empath learns to live as if his sensitivity were an obligation. He enters an environment and perceives tensions that no one verbalizes. He feels the change in the tone of his voice, the discomfort hidden behind a smile, the sadness disguised as irritation. At home, he becomes a mediator. Among friends, he becomes a counselor. In the relationship, it becomes an emotional shelter. Gradually, their ability to perceive the other ceases to be just a quality and becomes a function. He doesn't just feel. He begins to believe that he needs to solve what he feels. This transformation usually starts early. The sensitive child receives praise when he avoids conflicts, when he understands the adult, when he gives in, when he behaves as if he had the maturity to carry emotions that do not belong to him. Each renunciation receives a small psychological reward: approval, momentary peace, a sense of usefulness. Thus, a dangerous confusion is born. The individual comes to associate kindness with self-abandonment. The more you endure, the more you believe you love. The more he is silent, the more he believes that he has evolved. The more you sacrifice, the more you feel that you have value. But the psyche does not forget what conscience tries to justify. In Jung's symbolic language, that which is rejected does not disappear. It descends into the shadow. Every limit ignored, every intuition silenced, every manipulation perceived and excused leaves a mark. The empath can continue to smile, help, and offer new chances. But in an underground region of his personality, something begins to register patterns. He knows who uses guilt. He knows who disappears when he doesn't need him. You know who transforms affection into demand. You know who promises change, just to regain access to your energy. The strangest thing is that this knowledge is rarely used as a weapon. The empath notices a lot, but continues to choose to interpret everything in the most benevolent way possible. He sees the potential where he should see the behavior. He sees the wound of the other and forgets his own. Imagine who that person could become, and, little by little, lose touch with who they really are. Jung would draw attention to the danger of projection. When we place an image on someone produced by our own inner need, we stop finding the real person and start to relate to a construction. That's why the breaking point is rarely born out of a small conflict. It arises when reality becomes impossible to reinterpret. It can be a betrayal, an uncovered lie, an unexpected humiliation, a manipulation so evident that no justification can hide it anymore. At that moment, something breaks. But maybe it's not the heart. Maybe it's illusions. And the deepest pain doesn't just come from what the other has done. It comes from the realization that intuition had already warned many times. Then, a disturbing question arises. What if the greatest betrayal did not come from outside? What if the empath realizes that, for years, he abandoned his own perception to preserve bonds that depended precisely on this abandonment? This discovery changes everything. Anger ceases to point only at the one who is hurt and begins to illuminate the inner region where the individual has learned to deny himself. It is then that the shadow, previously treated as a threat, begins to reveal another face. The shadow of the empath is not necessarily cruel. Often, she is just the part that knows how to say no. It is the voice that desires distance. It is instinct that recognizes danger. It is the force that prefers to lose a relationship than to lose its own integrity. For a long time, this part was repressed because it seemed selfish, harsh, or incompatible with the image of a good person. But that which has been repressed returns when the personality can no longer sustain the division. And when he returns, he doesn't come asking permission. The person simply gets tired of explaining. Stop responding immediately. He stops running to put out emotional fires created by others. He observes the drama without entering into it, not because he has lost the ability to feel, but because he begins to realize that feeling does not mean obeying. This distinction seems small, but it represents an inner revolution. It is at this point that the so-called stop caring takes on another meaning. The empath does not cease to have heart. He stops giving the heart automatically. The energy that once flowed to everyone begins to return to the center. The attention turns inward. Silence ceases to be empty and becomes a border. And just when everyone expects him to return to his old role, something unexpected begins to be born. A consciousness that can no longer be controlled by guilt in the same way. In the next step, this change becomes visible. People who were used to the old availability begin to react, push, and test limits. And it is in this confrontation that the empath discovers whether his transformation is just a passing fatigue or the real beginning of a new identity. Change is almost never announced. The empath does not gather the family to declare that he has become someone else. He does not send a manifesto to his friends. It does not explain at length why it decided to protect its own energy. Most of the time, he just begins to do less of what destroyed him. The manipulative message goes unanswered. The call made just to dump problems goes to voicemail. The request that would previously provoke an automatic yes receives a simple I can't. For those who have become accustomed to having unlimited access, small borders seem like great aggressions. It is at this moment that the surrounding system reveals its true structure. While the empath carried conflicts, many relationships seemed to work. He was the invisible buffer between people who didn't know how to talk. He was the one who translated the anger from one to the other, who justified behaviors, who remembered birthdays, who restored peace after the explosions. When this function disappears, the apparent harmony begins to crack, not because the empath destroyed anything, but because it failed to hide what was already broken. Imagine a family in which a single person always arranges the meetings, calms the mother, understands the father, helps the siblings, and accepts jokes that hurt her to avoid confusion. One day, she remains polite, but stops intervening. The mother must deal directly with her own resentment. The father no longer finds someone willing to translate his silence. The brothers discover that their conflicts will no longer be resolved by a third person. Suddenly, everyone asks, "What happened to you?" The question seems innocent, but it often means something else. Why aren't you longer occupying the place that made our lives easier? The transformation of the empath is disturbing because it forces each person to rediscover responsibilities that had been placed on him. That is why accusations of selfishness, coldness, and ingratitude arise. The old paper was so convenient that any attempt to get out of it feels like a breach of contract, even though that contract was never consciously signed. A Jungian reading helps to understand the paradox. Individuation requires that the person cease to live only as a character constructed by external expectations. The persona, the face adapted to the world, has utility, but it becomes a prison when it replaces the whole individual. The empath may have built a persona of caregiver, peacemaker, and savior. Everyone likes this mask because it offers comfort. The problem is that behind it, there is a human being tired of being loved only when he performs a function. When the persona begins to drop, the reaction of others can intensify. There are sudden crises, dramatic messages, attempts to provoke guilt, memories of everything that was supposedly done for him. Some people become extremely affectionate for a few days. Others attack. Others threaten to leave. The unconscious goal is similar, to find out which button still works. But the awakened empath begins to observe these movements as patterns, not orders. This observation changes the everyday experience. Before, a hostile silence could ruin your day. Now he perceives the silence, feels the discomfort, and continues living. Before, an unfair accusation generated hours of explanations. Now he wonders if the explanation is really necessary. Before, someone's sadness immediately activated the rescue impulse. Now, he is able to remain present without taking responsibility for eliminating the pain of others. Is this indifference, or is it the birth of a more mature compassion? The difference is in consciousness. Coldness tries not to feel. Integration allows you to feel without getting lost. The empath continues to perceive the environment, but no longer considers each emotion detected a personal mission. He may recognize someone's anxiety and not absorb it. You can love a person and still walk away. He can wish the good of someone without participating in the cycle that fuels his destruction. At work, this transformation also causes strangeness. The person who did extra tasks, covered colleagues, absorbed conflicts, and remained available beyond hours, begins to fulfill his function well without offering his own nervous system as a free resource. It stops confusing excellence with exploration. He does not abandon responsibility. It abandons the excess that has been normalized, and when the structure depended on this excess, the environment can react as if it has become less compromised. In love relationships, the change is even more intense. The partner accustomed to automatic forgiveness encounters a new reality. Actions now produce consequences. The empath does not need to shout to demonstrate that something has changed. It can simply interrupt a disrespectful conversation, refuse a repetitive dynamic, or leave a bond that demands its diminishment. Power is precisely in the absence of spectacle. This is where the integrated shadow shows its protective function. The part previously called selfish proves capable of preserving what boundless goodness was destroying. The person learns that a limit is not punishment. It is information. It communicates how far a relationship can go without violating the integrity of those who participate in it. Those who respect this limit can approach in a truer way. Whoever needs to destroy it in order to remain reveals the nature of the connection itself, and then a surprising inversion occurs. The empath who has always feared losing people begins to realize that some losses are forms of protection. Certain distances hurt, but they also give back psychic space. The silence that once seemed like abandonment is beginning to look like peace. Loneliness ceases to be a threat and becomes an inner laboratory. For the first time, he can hear his own voice without the permanent chorus of the needs of others. This transformation also requires patience. A pattern built over years does not disappear in a single decision. There will be moments of doubt, nostalgia, and the desire to return to the known role. The essential thing is to realize that emotional relapse does not mean failure. Each time the person recognizes the mechanism before obeying it, consciousness gains space, but that peace is yet to be tested, because after the boundaries appear, a more subtle temptation arises to use the new clarity to judge, control, or punish. The next stage of awakening is not just learning to say no. It is to discover what to do with the power to see what previously remained hidden. When the empath is no longer governed by the need to please, an old ability seems to become clearer: the perception of patterns. He always noticed energy changes, contradictions, silences, and small inconsistencies. But before he filtered everything by a compulsive hope. Now hope ceases to distort observation. The person no longer needs to turn clear signals into comfortable excuses. She begins to see behavior as behavior. This can produce an almost otherworldly feeling. Someone enters your life with excessive intensity, grandiose promises, and fast-paced intimacy. Before, the empath might interpret that as a rare connection. Now he watches the rhythm. He asks why there is so much urgency. Notice when words and actions do not match. You don't need to diagnose anyone. Just recognize that something doesn't seem stable and allow time to reveal the rest. The change is not in possessing magical powers. It is in stopping silencing information that has always been available. Jung insisted on the importance of bringing unconscious contents to consciousness. When a previously ignored pattern becomes visible, it loses some of the power to control the person. The empath begins to recognize not only others, but also the very internal mechanism that attracted him to rescue relationships. And here, an uncomfortable question arises. Why are some sensitive people so attracted to those who need to be saved? Perhaps because saving offers identity. As long as there is someone in crisis, the empath knows what role to play. As long as someone depends on him, he feels that he has value. The relationship can be painful, but it also protects against a deeper question. Who am I when no one needs me? This question opens a door that many avoid. Without the role of caregiver, it can appear empty. The individual realizes that he has built routine, friendships, and even professional choices around emotional usefulness. When it ceases to serve as an emergency center for others, it must discover its own desires that have been dormant. And this can be more frightening than any external conflict. Individuation does not only offer freedom, it demands responsibility. It is no longer possible to permanently blame the manipulators if we keep choosing the same doors. This does not turn a victim into a culprit. It only means that consciousness, once acquired, asks for a new response. The awakened empath begins to ask, what in me still confuses intensity with love? What still confuses need with bond? What still calls destiny that which may be repetition? With each answer, the old identity loses strength. The individual learns to differentiate compassion from fusion. Compassion says, I recognize your pain. Fusion says, your pain is now my responsibility. Compassion can offer presence. Fusion requires sacrifice. Compassion respects the autonomy of the other. Fusion transforms the empath into a savior and the other into someone permanently incapable. What happens when he realizes this? Many relationships change without any dramatic discussion. The person stops giving unsolicited advice, stops solving problems that others can solve. It refuses to assume consequences produced by other people's choices. Instead of carrying someone, it offers space for them to walk. To some people, this feels less like love. In fact, it may be the first form of love that does not feed dependence. But there is another danger. By finding that they can read patterns clearly, the empath may be tempted to use this knowledge as a weapon. After all, he knows the weaknesses, fears, and contradictions of people who have spent years confiding secrets. It could hurt with precision. I could expose, could manipulate back. It could turn perception into revenge. It is precisely here that integration is distinguished from reaction. If the new force only serves to reverse positions, the old game continues. The oppressed becomes controlling, but remains stuck on the same axis. True liberation happens when the individual no longer needs to overcome the person who hurt him. It simply stops offering access. The absence of revenge is not born of weakness, but of the perception that continuing psychologically attached to the aggressor, even out of hatred, is still a form of imprisonment. Could you walk away without needing to be understood? This is perhaps one of the most difficult tests. For years, the empath wanted everyone to recognize his intentions. I wanted to explain each limit to avoid seeming cruel. He wanted to get out of toxic relationships without anyone considering him ungrateful. But inner sovereignty requires accepting that some people will interpret your freedom as an offense. From there, what we can call the mirror effect is born. The presence of someone who does not react automatically makes other people's behaviors reveal themselves more quickly. Manipulators find it difficult because they don't find the old circuit of blame and reward. Authentic people, by contrast, experience relief. They don't need to perform fragility or strength. They can simply exist in front of someone they see without trying to control it. The social circle begins to reorganize itself. Emergency-based relationships decrease. Conversations based on reciprocity increase. The empath discovers that intimacy doesn't have to be built on shared trauma. It can be born of curiosity, creation, humor, comfortable silence, and respect. Emotional life no longer feels like a hospital open 24 hours a day. And then, another question arises. If you no longer need to be needed, what do you choose to create? This question shifts the energy from rescue to construction. Sensitivity that was previously consumed by crises can be channeled into art, study, work, spirituality, nature, or more conscious relationships. The gift ceases to be a leak and becomes direction. Gradually, the person understands that they do not need to become tough to remain protected. Firmness can coexist with tenderness. Discernment can coexist with compassion. And this union of opposites is precisely one of the most powerful images of integration, not amputating parts of the personality, but putting them at the service of a more complete life. However, before this new life is consolidated, there is one last crossing. The empath must face the guilt that appears when everything starts to calm down. Because for those who have lived for years in chaos, peace can seem strangely wrong. And it is at this point that the old conditioning tries to come back through the back door. Guilt usually arises just when life begins to improve. The phone rings, and the empath does not answer. A few minutes later, she feels pressure in her chest. He turns down an invitation that he knows would exhaust him, and then begins to imagine that he has let someone down. He spends a weekend alone, finally at peace, but an inner voice asks if he shouldn't be helping, visiting, solving, or offering something. That voice doesn't always belong to the present. Often, it is the echo of years of conditioning. It is the child who learned that she had to be easy to be loved. It is the adolescent who discovered that conflicts decreased when he swallowed his own opinion. It is the adult who has received approval whenever he has exceeded his own limits. When life changes, the body can continue to wait for the old punishment. Therefore, setting limits does not immediately end the process. The empath may rationally know that he or she made the correct choice and still feel guilty. Transformation requires enduring this discomfort without interpreting it as proof that you are wrong. Old emotions are not necessarily instructions. Sometimes they are just signs that a pattern is losing territory. A Jungian perspective allows us to see this moment as a confrontation between the known identity and the broader self. The old personality says, "If you are not needed, you will be abandoned." The emerging consciousness responds, "If I have to abandon myself in order not to be abandoned, this bond already exacts too high a price." Between these two voices there is tension, and it is in this tension that a new psychic structure can be born. Everyday life offers small tests. A relative sends a guilt-laden message. The empath reads, feels the old urgency, and decides to wait. A colleague tries to transfer a responsibility. He perceives the automatic impulse to accept, breathes, and asks what really belongs to him. A partner raises the tone. Instead of entering the cycle of justifications, he ends the conversation and returns when there is respect. None of these actions seem grandiose, but each of them reorganizes the inner world. A person proves to himself that he can survive the discomfort of not pleasing. He discovers that someone's silence is not an emergency, that disapproval is not death, that a boundary can produce tension without destroying true love. And above all, he learns that those who only remain when he abandons himself are not offering a secure bond. There is something almost alchemical about this phase. The same sensitivity that once caused overload begins to produce discernment. The empath continues to perceive nuances, but now adds an essential question. Does this belong to me? The sadness of the other can be real without becoming your task. The anger of the other can be legitimate without determining your decision. The need of the other can exist without automatically becoming an obligation. This question creates space between perception and response. And in this space, freedom is born. Before, to feel was to react. Now, feeling is just the first movement. Then comes awareness, choice, and finally action. This simple sequence completely changes the experience of those who have spent their lives functioning as a reflection of the emotions of others. It also changes the way of loving. Love is no longer measured by the suffering endured. The empath begins to distrust the old belief that deep relationships need to be difficult, intense, and exhausting. He discovers that stability is not boredom, that respect is not a lack of passion, that reciprocity is not a luxury. and that someone can love him without having to break him to prove the strength of the bond. Some relationships adapt. Mature people realize the new limits and adjust the way they relate. They apologize without turning the request into a spectacle. They respect a no. They ask before dumping problems. They also offer listening, presence, and care. In these relationships, the awakening of the empath does not destroy the bond. He purifies it. Other relationships collapse, not because the empath became cruel, but because the bond depended on an asymmetry. When unlimited availability disappears, so does the main advantage that kept the other person interested. This revelation can be painful, but also liberating. It shows which connections were linked to the essence and which were linked to the function. The most surprising thing is that, after some time, the empath begins to feel less need to explain everything. Your energy becomes quieter. He does not announce that he has acknowledged a manipulation. It does not need to reveal every contradiction. Simply adjust the distance. Clarity doesn't have to be loud to be powerful. It is at this stage that many confuse peace with coldness. The person no longer participates in circular discussions, does not try to convince those who have decided not to understand, and does not offer unlimited access just to prove that they have a good heart. She can wish someone well and still keep the door shut. You can forgive internally and never return to the same place, but there is an even deeper transformation waiting ahead. When guilt loses strength, there is energy left, and this energy, previously consumed by drama, begins to search for destiny. The question ceases to be, who needs me, and becomes, what does my life want to create through me? This is when awakening stops being just defense and begins to become purpose. When the energy returns to the center, life changes texture. The empath realizes how much time was consumed by repetitive conversations, manufactured crises, worries that belong to other people, and endless attempts to predict the mood of those around him. The newfound silence seems wide. At first, it can even be scary. Then, it becomes raw material. It is in this space that forgotten desires begin to reappear. An abandoned project, a desire to study, a trip that is always postponed, a creative activity that seemed less important than solving the family's problems. The person realizes that he has spent years treating his own life as an interval between other people's emergencies. Now, for the first time, there is continuity. The sensitivity also changes function. Instead of detecting only danger, she begins to perceive beauty. The empath notices what inspires him, which environments expand his mind, which people make his body relaxed, which conversations produce energy instead of draining it. The nervous system slowly learns that it does not need to live in permanent surveillance. This change can alter professional choices. Those who have always been used as informal mediators begin to look for work with clear boundaries. Those who absorbed the tension of entire teams learn to collaborate without carrying everything. Some direct perception to art, writing, therapy, research, teaching, or activities that transform sensibility into creation. Others simply discover that they do not need to turn the gift into a profession. They can protect it as an intimate part of their own existence. The house also acquires another meaning. Before, it could function as an extension of external demands, unexpected visits, constant phone calls, endless availability. Now, it becomes a sanctuary, not in the sense of hostile isolation, but of a space where the psyche can return to its own rhythm. The empath learns that resting before being destroyed is legitimate. Over time, a new selection happens naturally. People who only sought access begin to disappear. Some call the empath distant. Others say that he has changed. And they are right. The difference is that this change does not need to be defended. The individual does not require everyone to understand his transformation. He accepts that each person will see only what his or her own conscience allows. At the same time, more authentic relationships are beginning to gain ground. The empath realizes that he does not need to prove value by offering infinite availability. You may arrive tired and say that you don't have the energy to talk. You can ask for help, You can admit that you don't know. It can be cared for without feeling ashamed. This sounds simple, but for someone trained to exist as a source and never as a receiver, receiving is a revolution. Reciprocity becomes a new criterion, not a rigid accounting in which every gesture needs to be returned, but a sense of flow. Is there interest on both sides? Is there respect? Is there emotional responsibility? Does the bond allow both to be human? These questions replace the old criterion. Does this person need me? This is where the empath becomes more difficult to manipulate, not because he developed an impenetrable armor, but because he failed to negotiate basic principles to avoid abandonment. The threat of estrangement loses power when the person has already discovered that he can survive loneliness. Guilt loses strength when she understands that a no does not destroy her goodness. Idealization loses strength when behavior is worth more than promises. Still, true maturity does not consist in turning every encounter into research. The empath does not have to live looking for narcissists, liars, or manipulators around every corner. That would be just another form of surveillance. Integration allows for something more serene, observing, giving time, and trusting in the ability to act if a troubling pattern appears. This confidence in yourself is perhaps the most important achievement. Before, the fear was not only of being hurt, it was to be hurt, and then convince yourself that it didn't happen. Now, the person knows that if something violates his integrity, he will listen to his own perception. He does not need to control the future because he trusts that he will not abandon himself again. And this certainty produces a silent force. The empath can remain gentle without being naive. It can remain open without being available for everything. You can love without turning love into license for abuse. You can forgive without reopening doors. You can understand the source of someone's pain without accepting to be the target of it. At this point, stop caring reveals its true nature. What died was not compassion. The compulsion to manage everyone's emotional life has died. The need to be indispensable is dead. The fantasy that enough love can transform someone who does not want to change is dead. The habit of offering new chances where there has never been responsibility has died. And when these structures fall, something deeper arises. Sovereignty. Not sovereignty as dominion over others, but as responsibility over one's own inner world. The empath begins to choose where they put their attention, time, intimacy, and energy. What was once distributed out of guilt is now offered out of conscience. Gradually, the person understands that they do not need to become tough to remain protected. Firmness can coexist with tenderness. Discernment can coexist with compassion. This union of opposites transforms sensitivity into conscious force, not into open wound. But the final stage requires more than securing borders. It requires transforming this sovereignty into a way of life. The last question is not who should be excluded, but who you become when you no longer organize your identity around the pain of others. And it is this answer that ends the crossing. The final stage is not a room where the empath walks in and never feels pain again. There is no awakening that completely eliminates human vulnerability. The difference is different. The person no longer interprets sensitivity as a sentence. She feels it, but she stays with herself. He loves, but does not abandon himself. Listens, but does not absorb automatically. It helps, but it doesn't transform help into an obligation to disappear so that the other exists. This state can be understood as a form of integration. Light and shadow cease to fight as enemies. Compassion does not have to destroy the protective instinct. Kindness does not have to drive out steadfastness. Spirituality does not have to require martyrdom. The person realizes that being whole is more important than appearing pure. Carl Jung placed at the center of his work the need to confront that which has been rejected by consciousness. For the empath, this encounter can mean recovering precisely the qualities that for years have been condemned: assertiveness, selectivity, silence, distance, self-preservation. When these forces are no longer repressed, They do not need to explode in a destructive way. They can serve the conscience. In practice, the path begins with a simple question: is what I am feeling mine? Before responding to a message, getting into a discussion, or taking on a problem, there is a moment when that question can change everything. If the emotion belongs to the other, you can recognize it without embodying it. If the responsibility is not yours, you can refuse without building an endless defense. The second practice is to observe the body. Often, the mind creates justifications, while the body has already perceived the pattern. Constant tension, exhaustion after certain encounters, the need to recuperate for hours, fear of saying no, the feeling of walking on eggshells. None of this needs to be immediately transformed into a diagnosis about another person, but it can be received as information about the experience that relationship produces in you. The third practice is to replace promise with default. People can say anything in moments of fear, guilt, or seduction. The pattern reveals what repeats itself. Is there respect after the apology? Is there sustained change? Is there reciprocity when you stop offering everything? The awakened empath learns not to build a life on one's imagined potential. The fourth practice is to allow the not to be complete. That doesn't work for me, may be enough of a phrase. Excessive explanations are often attempts to gain permission to own a boundary, and a limit that depends on the approval of those who exceed it is not yet a fully assumed limit. The fifth practice is to learn to receive, receiving care, help, time, kindness, and presence, without immediately feeling like you need to pay back. For many empathetic people, this is one of the most difficult experiences because it reveals how much they were used to measuring value by usefulness. Reciprocity heals precisely because it shows that you can be loved without performing a function. The sixth practice is to build a life that does not depend on crises. This means creating routines, projects, relationships, and spaces that have value, even when no one is asking for help. Sensitivity needs direction. When you don't find purpose, you may go back to chaos just because the chaos is familiar. And there's one last practice: accept that some people won't like your transformation. Maybe they'll say you've changed. Perhaps they miss the version that responded immediately, forgave without consequence, and carried weights in silence. You don't need to convince them that your move is legitimate. Life itself becomes the answer. The awakened person is not the one who feels nothing. She is the one who no longer gives the steering wheel to everything she feels. There is a space between stimulus and response, between guilt and action, between compassion and sacrifice. In this space, consciousness chooses. That is why the moment when the empath stops caring can be understood as a spiritual paradox. He stops caring about the obligation to save everyone and starts caring about the integrity of his own soul. Stop caring about the approval of those who only accept you without limits, and start caring about relationships that support truth. Stop caring about keeping toxic systems running, and start caring about the peace that is born when each person takes their own responsibility. Freedom does not come as permanent euphoria. It often comes as a quiet afternoon where no one needs to be rescued, and for the first time, you don't feel guilty about it. It comes when a manipulative message pops up and you realize you don't have to respond. It comes when someone leaves, and despite the sadness, you don't run after it to negotiate your own dignity. Then the transformation is completed in another way. The empath does not become inaccessible to love. It becomes inaccessible to exploitation, disguised as love. It does not become cold. It becomes selective. It does not lose its humanity. It stops offering it as a currency to buy belonging. If you recognize this passage in your own history, perhaps the silence that has arisen within you is not empty. Maybe it's space. Perhaps what seemed to be the end is the first moment when his energy really came home. If this content made sense to you, like the video and subscribe to the channel. And in the comments, write "I am done," even anonymously if you prefer. Not as a declaration of defeat, but as a symbol that you no longer wish to abandon yourself to keep the peace of those who have never protected yours. The awakening does not end when you stop carrying the world. Maybe it starts right there.